Discord is a great place to find people. That's where I have my community, and there are literally millions of people there in different groups from all over the world. And I'm in groups, for example, different shows that I like to watch, like Doctor Who. I'm in servers to learn new things like Midjourney. There's a support group for my autoimmune disease that I'm in, language groups for learning and practicing, and I'm even in a cheese community because I love cheese. Yes, they even have communities for people who are passionate about cheese making. So, tons of Discord groups. And today I'm talking with Greg, who is someone I know from another Discord server. And we're going to talk more about that specific one later. And Greg has been living in Japan for some time now, and now he works in translation. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about all the different layers related to translation. It's like a big old onion with that papery skin. Translation's not about substituting strings of words in Japanese for their counterparts in English. There are expressions and phrases to consider, and then there's just the art of being a good writer in your own first language or the language that you're translating into. And I was really surprised at all the things that I hadn't even considered about translation, and I'm sure that you're going to get a few insights that you hadn't thought of before too. Oh, and another thing. If you're watching the video version of this episode on YouTube, you're going to notice that Greg doesn't have his camera on. Of course, if you're just listening to the audio version, you're not going to notice a thing. But there's a good reason for that, and we're actually going to discuss it at the end of the video. So if you're watching this, you're going to notice that, and I just wanted to mention it. But for now, let's get on with the show. First, I wanted to say welcome and thanks for coming. And I'm going to say your name the way that I think you want to hear it, which is Greg. Welcome,
yes,
Greg.
It's all capitals because ideally it should be bellowed like a Viking or a caveman.
Perfect. But that's when I first saw your name too, and names are always difficult. Like nobody could say my name when I was growing up. When I was a child in the US, people will call me Bianca and Banaka and Bianca and everything else. So when I see somebody's name, I'm always like, I want to be sure to ask. And when I asked you, I said, should it be Greg? How should it be? And you mentioned something about video games, right?
Basically, my name is just Greg. And at some point, just as a dumb goof, as a bit, I just started to write my name in all caps, like some sort of caveman or something for just, video game
just
name. And, the file name there.
Nice. So we can call you Greg, we can call you Greg. Like that would be all okay with
you.
I
mean, honestly, whatever.
Uh-huh.
As long as I can recognize it.
You're fine with that. Yeah, I guess I have this like past trauma of people saying my name incorrectly. And even to this day, because I'm living in Mexico now, and every time I get into an Uber, every single time they're like, oh, Señora Blanca. And I'm like, it's not Blanca. I know that I looks like an L, but it's not. It's Bianca. And they have Bianca's here. It shouldn't be a problem.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I'm dating myself, but like honestly, my first reaction was like Bianca, like the breath spray.
Exactly. Which it's supposed to be Banaka.
Yeah, that's true too. Yeah, I had a feeling.
That's the one I got called when I was a kid. Did you ever watch, I think it was The Rescuers Down Under? There was two characters and they were mice, and one was Bernard and the other one was Bianca. Does that ring a bell for you?
Yeah, I saw that at a young age because it came out when I was at a young age. But yeah, that does sound familiar at least.
To date ourselves. So people either know the breath spray or they know the mouse, right?
There's worse.
Maybe this is a little before your time, mine too, but Mick Jagger of the Rolling Stones, his first wife was named Bianca Jagger. So some people will know her as well.
Yeah, I guess so. So if any of our parents are out there listening,
good on you. I'm pretty sure that's who I was named after.
Yeah, I don't think my parents were the types to listen to Rolling Stones though.
I know.
I'm going to be perfectly honest.
Oh, mine definitely were. But names aside, then I think people would be interested to know like how we know each other, right? Because you're in Japan, I'm in Mexico. How could we possibly know each other?
Yeah, I'm a mysterious me head floating in a void with no corporeal being.
That's how I met you, because we were both floating around.
Yeah, I'm a being of pure energy who exists only on the internet.
And we bumped into each other. Our energies just like collided. Yeah. Exactly.
We met, I believe, on the Discord chat for the podcast Enthusiasm, which I'm not involved in, but am a fan of. It's if you enjoy linguistics, then you will probably enjoy that podcast. And if you are willing to give them a few dollars a month to help them make the podcast and to pay for linguistics research projects that they can then fund through grants, you can also see the Discord and discover what a truly inescapable presence I am.
and all the different rabbit holes they have in the different channels. Yeah. And
Yeah.
I know this because I was also a fan of Lingthusiasm for a long time. And
Yeah.
as soon as they opened their Discord, I was like, oh yeah, or their Patreon, I think it was. They
Yes.
started the Patreon. I was like, yeah, I'm there. And I may not be there all the time. I think you were talking about me before we started recording about how, hey, if you don't see people very active on the server for a while, you're either kind of worried or you're happy
Yeah.
that they're
They're
successful. And I'm like,
probably
yeah,
either doing really well or really badly if you don't see people on Discord for a while.
like, yeah, I think you're talking about me right there. Because on that server, I'm not as active. And that's because I have my own server that I'm
Yeah.
worried about too. And I'm like, I wouldn't say I'm the moderator, but I'm the owner / I do a lot of moderation on there, on my server, I mean,
Yeah.
too. So that's how we know each other,
Yeah, there's
because I
definitely like a
love
crossover
enthusiasm.
point. Yeah. There's
Exactly.
like a crossover point where the owner stops being the moderator.
At some point, yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. I'm like, I'm
And
so busy. So busy
yeah.
doing it.
And to finish our plugs for them as well, Gretchen McCulloch is the author of Because Internet, which is a mass market pop linguistics book that is absolutely fascinating. When I read it a few years ago, I kept having to stop every few minutes in order to just share some fascinating fact with anybody within earshot.
And
I
people are
became
like,
very annoying.
yeah, exactly. So there's very few places I feel like for real word nerds, like gatherings, and Lingthusiasm Discord server is one of them for sure. And I know I needed a place for like my people too, who were really specific about not just linguistics in general, but phonology and phonetics and English. And especially my people are really into like American English. So I kind of I love that niche that they've created. I was so into it. And then I kind of created my niche too, because the book that you're mentioning, Because Internet, it just was so powerful for me when it first came out. And I used to buy it as gifts, for other people to be like, no, really,
It's such a
linguistics is
good book,
cool.
yeah.
Look. Yeah. And
You can finally find out why all the baby boomers write so many ellipses.
why we can never get like texting right. But I also, every July on Emoji Day, World Emoji Day, we always used to do like some kind of podcast episode, some kind of thing to talk about emojis. And we would always reference, I know it's chapter 5, because I've referenced it so many times. And we would always, like every July, we would always talk about it, me and somebody who is also interested in that kind of thing. So
Yeah.
World Emoji Day, July 17th. Mark your calendar, because that's the emoji that's on the calendar. And if you haven't read that book, read the book. If you are not in any other Discord servers, join mine, join Lingthusiasm. It's a way to support both of us. And they do a lot of research, which turns out to be fascinating. And so if you're not into Discord and you're like, what's that? At least join these two servers to get kind of started. So yeah, totally.
Yeah, just shout outs to the Lingthusiasm people, and also shout outs to Jeremy Emojipedia for deciding on World Emoji Day.
Yeah, good point, because we do need, I think, a reference for that, because it's just become so huge and so part of everyday life, It's totally worth the shout out. And so tell us a little bit about, before we found each other on that server, before I noticed how active you were and I reached out to you to have this conversation, tell us a little bit about why you're in Japan. How did that start? Like, what are you currently doing? Yeah, like give us a little info on you besides Caveman.
Yeah. I mean, like so many other people who live in Japan as American citizens, I began as somebody who worked on the JET program, teaching English in public schools, initially at a high school, and then I got transferred to a middle school for 4 more years, which was a really interesting look at the educational system in Japan. I do have criticisms of how they teach English, but that's kind of just a separate personal matter that's neither here nor there. And then after that, for the last, 10, 12 years now, I've been working as a translator, initially freelance, and now I work in-house at a company. Basically, I won't go too much into details about like the specifics of my private life, partially because I'm not the kind of translator whose name shows up in the credits of things. I don't tend to work on like cool aspirational stuff that people dream of growing up and translating. Like I don't do TV shows or video games for the most part. Yeah, I mostly work in translation for things like sightseeing maps and websites and privacy policies and emails and your miscellaneous everything other than entertainment media translation, basically. So there's a lot of boring stuff, there's a lot of dry stuff, and there's a lot of interesting stuff too.
Can I pause you for a second? Is there anything that you were thinking like, oh, this is going to be boring, but it actually turned out to be quite interesting? Are there any of those little projects like that?
Oh, yeah, plenty. I don't know how detailed to get on kind of, NDA assumptions, but I have done a few translation jobs that were basically for museum exhibitions where they wanted to have bilingual signage for the write-ups about all the individual works and the background of the artist. And in one case, it was inspired by a famous Japanese artist of the, let's say, 19th century, maybe. I can't remember exactly. And it was done by a comic artist who'd done I guess, a fairly famous or fairly popular series that I had never heard of. And even though I had no familiarity with the comic artist himself, I did actually quite enjoy doing the translations for the different write-ups about the different works, because they were all inspired by, old ukiyo-e prints and kind of remixed with new characters in them, or otherwise modified with little details.
So you got to learn a lot about the art itself,
Yeah.
which probably was really kind of like interesting and unexpected then.
Yeah, I mean, it was a lot of cool little insights about details of the original works that I never really noticed, because, there's only so long that you ordinarily will look at a piece of art unless you have some sort of reason to be forced to. Yeah, for better or for worse. I mean, it's also a good exercise to just look intently at a painting for, a few minutes or whatever. I've also done things like, cooking related translation, a lot of recipes in the past. And that was actually very educational, because I like to cook. And so I've actually picked up quite a lot of useful knowledge from that. But yeah, for
and
the most part,
both of those things are sorry to interrupt. I was going to say, both of those things are actually really more important than you might think of at first, because anybody who has traveled and gone to a museum in another place and has seen those translations, like, you see some really bad stuff out there translated. And you think, oh, prepositions aren't important. Prepositions are so important. It's the little things, or let's say you're cooking and maybe it's order or the amount or something about the procedure that can make or break, the dish, not to be too dramatic about it, but like that stuff is important, to the person who needs it.
And there's at least one city in Japan where if you have traveled there and picked up tourism sightseeing pamphlets, you've probably seen my work, just because
that's cool.
There's a lot of regional travel materials that I've worked on.
So you're helping people too, which I think is great, right?
There's a lot of actual practical stuff involved.
Very cool. Oh, very cool. So I want to back up for just a second too, for I realize people might not know, just in general, but you mentioned this program called the JET program. And I know it because I had a friend who was in it. But for people who think you're talking about airplanes, what is it actually, the JET program?
Yeah, it's a thing that the Japanese government started back in the 80s, I want to say, kind of as a soft power thing, I guess, where they started to hire people from abroad to come in and work as nominally what they call like assistant language teachers. And what the actual nature of the work is depends entirely on the school and such and your coworkers. But yeah, basically you're coming in and you're working as an assistant to help out like the teachers who are like the actual Japanese people who teach English in the schools. And the nature of that assistance can vary. It famously can go anywhere from the so-called human tape recorder all the way up to being like closely involved in lesson planning and trying to figure out activities to encourage students to practice using English as a communicative tool rather than kind of approaching it the way that you might teach Latin in a Western country, where it's just a dead language that you're decoding into real words.
It's not going to sound natural maybe, and like they think that the details kind of don't matter. And it's really like just book exercises.
Yeah, I mean, in a very real sense, in Japan, the main reason to study English for most people is to get into high school or to get into college. The media landscape here is almost entirely in Japanese. There are virtually no foreign TV shows on broadcast television outside of a couple for children. And even those are dubbed.
I was thinking that's interesting.
Yeah, it's very different from Europe in that regard.
So really the opportunity to even use the language is not really there.
That's very limited,
I guess these days, with being able to be online and being in different groups and all the apps that are available, it's way better than it used to be. But still, there's like maybe not that habit, or something like that.
It's kind of like if you're in America and you want to study Dutch. Like, you're not going to find much Dutch music on the radio. You're not going to find much Dutch television programming available. It's kind of hard to encounter native Dutch speakers in everyday life.
Yeah. On the other hand, Dutch is so closely related to English. It's true.
So the analogy does break down.
Yeah. Whereas Japanese is seemingly so different. I don't know any Japanese to speak of, but let's bring that back around to your work translating then. So you were teaching English, you were kind of an assistant in the school for this program, and then you stayed and you got into translation work. And tell us a little bit about that, because one of the things that struck me was when you were talking about the signage and the art. and
Hmm.
how I thought, I love going to museums, and I used to work in museums, so it's maybe me
Yeah.
more than others. I love the information. I love to read that stuff. So if it's well done, it's really a pleasure to read, and can
Yeah.
be really like add a lot to the thing that you're
Hmm.
looking at. So I think how it ends up, that product can have kind
Hmm.
of an art to it. There's something really to be said for that. So tell us a
Hmm.
little bit about, if you don't mind, how you got started in translation and kind of like what it's like for you, if you don't mind.
Oh yeah. I just started out as a freelancer, as so many do. And due to the nature of translation as effectively writing work, the sort of first step that I always tell people who are interested in working in the industry is that first you should live with someone who can financially support the household on their own, because working as a freelance writer of any sort is not lucrative for quite a while. And if you keep
Mm.
at it, you can barely get by.
If you're lucky, maybe.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's not a whole lot of money in the industry for the most part, with the exception of like
Yeah.
maybe some very few high profile jobs. And yeah, I started out as freelancing for a while, and then after a year or two, through just serendipity of knowing some people who knew some people who met some people, I wound up
Mhm.
working in house at a company and have been working on that since then.
And tell me if this is true. I don't know if it's true.
Hmm.
It's a thought that came to my mind that the
Certainly.
employers of people who need translation, maybe it's more about getting the job done and it's not so much about the quality and the artistic endeavor or the end product. Is that true to a certain degree? Like they just need it done, they need it translated, or are they really looking at the quality of the output, or can they even judge?
Yeah, that's the thing, because a lot of the time, the whole point of hiring a translator is that you can't do it yourself. And
Mhm,
so,
mhm.
for instance, I'm going to make an assumption here, but if you needed something translated into Thai, how would you gauge how well done it was?
But besides asking somebody else who was
Right.
just as,
Yeah.
hopefully just as good or even better,
Yeah.
so they could know the difference. Yeah, yeah,
Right.
that's what I just
And
realized.
so there is that challenge where sometimes you will have middle manager types, for instance, who would like to demonstrate value by providing feedback based on
Mm.
what they remember from English class in high school or college. And they like to offer feedback on a language they don't speak that well a lot of the
I was gonna say
time.
unsolicited feedback, I'm sure.
It really depends, but yes, really depends. There's a sort of a political diplomatic element too for the customer
Mm,
facing work, where you have to sometimes find ways to incorporate their requests and suggestions without,
uh-huh.
like, they'll want something very specific, and even if it's weird or arguably
Mm.
simply wrong, there are still ways to incorporate that feedback such
Yeah,
that
yeah.
they will be
They're still
pleased
the
or
customer.
satisfied. Yeah, I
Uh-huh,
mean, yeah,
uh-huh.
that's kind of the long
Yeah,
and short
yeah,
of it, is like they're the
yeah,
customer. I can get precious, but like, at a
yeah.
restaurant, the kitchen only has so much control over how you eat your meal.
It's a great analogy.
Like, you
Right?
can
Yeah.
bring your
You
own
can have the
ketchup
best
to a
chef.
steak
Uh-huh.
shop or a steakhouse or something.
That's a perfect analogy. Yeah, I love talking about these things in analogies because they're just like kind of difficult to grasp otherwise, unless I imagine you've been there, right? Like you've
Yeah.
been there and you have, I'm sure there's like little tiny stories about words and phrases and things that are hilarious at the time. But if you don't know the context, it's not like probably as funny. But if you can
Yeah.
remember any specific like instances like what you're saying, you're like, oh, they really wanted to say this thing, but it made absolutely no sense because they were translating an idiom or something like that. If you can remember any
Yeah, I mean,
little anecdotes like that,
it's
we're
just a thing
always
that
ears.
happens sometimes in some regards. Like, basically, people will look at a bilingual dictionary and get absolutely fixated on the wrong corresponding word, or just make changes and say, like, I think this sounds better, or I
Uh-huh.
think this sounds more natural. And this is coming from a non-native speaker providing their non-fluent feedback. But
Hmm.
it's just kind
They
of
just
part of the job
they just
ultimately.
like how it sounds sometimes, which can be
Yeah.
very different than like, yes, oh, you like the sonority of it, but actually we listen to things in a different way, maybe, right? And that just
Yeah.
doesn't do it for us.
I
Yeah, if
mean,
you
like,
think,
ultimately, it's all just vibes, right?
uh-huh, uh-huh. Yeah,
It's
what
all
are you
just
trying to get
mouth sounds.
across? It's the communication. And it just kind of makes me think too of like the rhythm too. Maybe because Japanese has a different rhythm structure, right? That maybe they do kind of just hear how things flow differently than we might with our rhythm system. We have that time stress rhythm
Yeah.
versus, yeah,
Yeah,
versus
Japanese
how
has more
they
of a,
do.
yeah, like a very steady,
Mhm.
evenly patterned
Exactly.
sort of a
Yeah.
yeah, prosody to it.
maybe to them it does sound better.
Oh, this is also for written
like
text a lot of the time, so.
yeah, not something you would orate necessarily, right? Like not like lines in dialogue on stage or something. So this is still on my mind. I want to circle back to the idea of like, okay, I've made this translation, right? I took some text and I made some text in the end. We were kind of chatting a little bit before, but I want to bring this back up again for the listeners is it seems to be all about you're the native speaker, you're doing the job. You need to know in English, your first language, how to be a good writer, right? In the end, it's how you compose that thing, right? Tell us more about that.
Right. I mean, probably the most common misconception about translation is that people will just generally work bilingually. And interpretation by its nature will generally be people working in both directions. But if you're doing like written text, then as a general guideline, you're going to be writing in your own native language due to the fact that translation work is at its core primarily writing work. And so it's important to be able to understand the source text, like regardless of the language you're working with. Like it's important to understand the source text, but easily more than half of the work of the job is figuring out how to express that in the target language. And so as a result, like a lot of the time when we're working with freelancers, especially if I describe somebody's work as being extremely accurate, I mean that as some of the most savage criticism imaginable, because it usually means that they are not concerning themselves with things like, does this sentence structure sound good or even vaguely natural in English? Or is this word choice used by English speakers writing for English speakers? And so there's a very, dare I say, dangerous tendency among a lot of less experienced translators to kind of think of the source text as sacrosanct rather than essentially just very detailed notes for writing work that you're doing.
And the meaning has to come across more than the words
themselves.
Right? Yeah, exactly. The full forest of the trees kind of thing, it seems like, you know?
And because of the very different natures of the sentence structures of Japanese and English, because Japanese is a SOV language where the verb comes at the end.
Right.
And so
subject, just to explain for everybody out there, subject, object, then verb. For example, subject, I gave you a gift. This is in English. I gave him a gift, right? I, subject, verb, gave, gift, object. So in Japanese, you said it's subject, object, verb. So it would be more like me, gift, gave.
I gift, gave. Essentially.
I gift, gave,
More or less. And there are a lot of languages that have that structure. Hindi, for instance. Apparently, it's the most common sentence structure among languages worldwide. But that's so neither here nor there,
But just to give some context, absolutely.
Because of the different nature of the sentence structures and things like how in Japanese, instead of having relative pronouns that come after the thing they're modifying with like a phrase, you'll put that before the noun when you're modifying it. And so a lot of time, less experienced translators of Japanese to English especially will start sentences with very long, awkward modifying clauses.
Like they'll start a sentence with, if we're talking about like relative pronouns, I think what you mean is that or which or who,
things like that
or something like that. So
and so you wind up with things like phrased awkwardly and without consideration for how they sound in the subject or the target language. Japanese translators will often use many dangling participles at the beginning of the sentences.
Exactly. So it may be word for word, like it looks more accurate because, you know, everything kind of lines up. But that doesn't mean that it ends up being a good translation at all, right? Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, at this point, I'm mostly just kind of listing pet peeves, honestly. But it's a very real concern that you have to have when you're working in translation, too, is you have to actually ask, is this something that a native speaker would conceivably produce for another native speaker? And the Japanese to English translation industry especially has kind of an industry-wide generational problem where a lot of people who work in Japanese to English translation nowadays essentially grew up with a media diet consisting almost entirely of media that was not written in their native language for speakers of their native language. Like you have a lot of people who grow up where all of their recreational media experience, you know, whether it's books or TV shows or movies or video games or whatever, it's almost all going to have come with like the linguistic component of it by way of a translator who may or may not have been particularly good as a writer in the target language. And so you have kind of a weakening of the linguistic immune system happening in a lot of cases where people have a less discerning sense of whether it sounds correct or even good in the
Mm-hmm.
target language.
Mm-hmm.
It's a
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
it's a very common problem. And honestly, the solution for
Yeah.
it is just read more things written by people in your native language for other people who speak your native language.
Uh-huh. Yeah, because when you said earlier, oh, does it sound natural? I was gonna say, whoa, back up. Is it comprehensible, first of
Yeah,
all?
that's
Uh-huh.
the first hurdle, of course. Yes.
Do I understand what's happening here? And because
Hmm.
even when we speak, like, because we could move those clauses around and it might sound really archaic, and we say, this is how somebody would have said it in the 1800s or something, this is how my grandma
Yeah.
would say it, but you have to kind of work at it, and the more you have to work at communication,
Yeah.
like, the less easy it becomes, probably the less you're going to
Hmm.
get out of it. So the goal is to make it simple, make it feel natural,
Yeah.
but I guess in the end, it depends on whose hands that gets back into, right? Like, let's
Yeah.
say in a museum, for example, right? Somebody is
Yeah.
going in the museum and they see this plaque and they're a tourist, right?
Hmm.
So English might be their first language. English might be a second
Yeah.
language, but they can't read the Japanese. So that's like the best that they can get. And so the higher the quality that is, the more
Hmm.
they can get out of it because the less they have to work at it,
Yeah.
Mhm.
And that's actually a separate matter too, with translating into English in a country that doesn't speak it, is that a lot of the time for just things like, getting around or just like other informational things like that, I do often have to try to make a point of avoiding specific regionalisms in the English writing that I produce. It'll be like minor things like, preferring the phrase mobile phone over cell phone, for instance, or using like parking area as a sort of a halfway neither fish nor fowl option instead of parking lot or car
Uh,
park, because
uh-huh.
both will sound extremely of one type of English. And,
Mm.
as a general guideline, we still kind of stick to US English conventions for things like spelling and punctuation. But,
Mhm.
ideally, you want to try to consider your audience, obviously. And if the
Exactly.
audience is international by nature, a lot of the time you want to kind of avoid more advanced vocabulary if you can, leaving aside the fact
Mhm.
that, of course, it's always hard to gauge what non-native speakers will actually know of a given language and what would be considered
Mhm.
advanced vocabulary for somebody from a given country.
Yeah, and I was gonna
Yeah.
say, a lot of times people they don't know what they don't know, right? So
Hmm.
if I learned, let's say, for example, French, right? Where
Yeah.
I grew up near the Canadian border, but in the U.S.
Hmm.
And so the French that I knew was maybe more Montrealese, and
Right.
so
You learned from
when I
Basil the
went to
Sesame Street
France,
there.
I didn't know, right? I didn't know until I had that contrast, and I thought, oh,
Yeah.
okay, never thought of that.
Hmm.
And so people will come to us, and maybe this happened to you when you were teaching, that people would say, oh, that's car park. You guys don't say car park. Why? Why do you say
Yeah.
driveway? And yeah, and they don't realize it until somebody maybe points it out. So I find that
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. English is
Yeah.
especially that way just because of the international influence of English and the different
Mm.
Englishes. And, once in
Exactly.
a while we'll get a client who specifically wants UK style English, and I have to
Hmm.
have to set the word spell check to UK English, and I make sure that I
A
add
lot of
the extra
OUs.
U's and words like savor,
Exactly.
and that I don't
Oh,
put
how
the
funny.
comma before the and.
I don't want to read that. Yeah, I'm very strongly in the Oxford comma camp. So don't let me see any of that
Yeah.
stuff. Yeah. And
You want to try to fit it into the ideal target
yeah.
place.
And like you said earlier, like number one, it's the audience. Number two, there's the customer to consider as
Yeah.
well. And like, what other things have you noticed that you maybe wanted to share with us about translating and what you've picked up so far? Because I'm sure a lot of people haven't thought this deeply about what it's like to translate things. They think, I'll just throw it into AI, right? Or, let me see what Google Translate can do. And
Yeah.
so there's a lot more, I think, to meet than meets the eye when it comes to translation. So what else would you tell us about?
I mean, briefly on the topic of like assisted translation tools and such. Yeah, there's kind of two general categories. Like there's computer assisted translation tools like Omega T or Trados that professional translators use for things like reference to make sure that they're consistent internally. And then there's things
Mm.
like, just your machine translations. And machine translation can be a useful tool at times just for, it's especially useful for like really dry materials, for things that have like a very like set format, like contracts
I
or
was
with a
gonna say
lot of
something legal.
terminology. And of course, machine translation tends to be very bad for things like prose or dialogue, which, is pretty much where you're going to need the most actual skill as a writer anyway. If you're not simply
Mhm.
effectively applying a template to what you're writing. And
Yeah.
even as
Yeah.
such, like machine translation can only go so far, because even for things like contracts, you have different conventions in different countries and different languages. In Japanese, for instance, for contracts, you have like the first party and the second party. In English language contracts, you usually have some sort of a one-word descriptor, like landlord and tenant. Tenant agrees to pay the rent to landlord by the first of each month or something like that. Whereas in Japanese, it's pretty much always the convention is the first party and the second party. And you have like these set words for that. And so even then with machine translation, you can't just use it as is because it will be very confusing to English speakers who are used to actually having a little bit more of a descriptive approach. And so even when using these tools, you have to treat them as tools rather than as freelancers, especially. And of course, there's also other issues with a lot of the time machine translations will give you overly literal things and won't really, they can miss the mark a lot with things like coinages that are more recent or more specifically, I guess, due to the perhaps outsized disproportionate influence of English on international communication in general, due to things like pop culture and just the internet came from the US, and so it has a sort of like English language bent to it. A lot of languages will have coinages that are sort of pseudo-English. And, that happens. There are a lot of them in like Europe as well. Like apparently the EU has its own variety of English, its own dialect of English where they use words that aren't really used by English speakers. But in Japanese, for instance, one that comes to mind as an example is that a few decades ago, the phrase sexual harassment arrived in Japanese as a loan word, like sexual harassment. And that, that kind of got like abbreviated like sekuhara just for ease of saying. It's kind of a mouthful to say in Japanese. And that harassment, like the word harassment kind of stuck around as a suffix, like a meaning-bearing suffix in Japanese. And so, for instance, in Japan, for a while now, the word for like abuse of authority, they call it power harassment or power harassment or power hara. And so that's kind of become this sort of like semantic treadmill where you have harassment as a suffix in Japanese kind of taking on a life of its own, and it's kind of been gaining momentum over time. Like very recently, I've even seen translated posters at convenience stores making reference to the literally translated phrase customer harassment, which sounds to an English speaker like it's store staff creating problems for customers and maybe being a nuisance, but it specifically refers to customers acting unreasonably or aggressively towards staff. And so the phrase is essentially entirely inside out from what a native English speaker would think it means.
And then how do you decouple that? And how do you, because in their minds, they're probably thinking, oh, yes, I already know the word for harassment, right? In English, I have my word for that. And if I know the word for client and this tourist comes in and they're kind of belligerent towards my employees at the 7-Eleven or whatever, then I can say to them in English, I can say client harassment.
Yeah, a lot of the times it's just a matter of you put a comment in the word file saying, strictly speaking, this word harassment. In English, it actually means like to harass rather than the act of harassment itself. And you can kind of explain it at times, but really the bigger issue is translation from Japanese into English. Like if you see the phrase power harassment in English language text, it's a sign that it was translated by somebody who like they kind of got almost there, but not quite, and didn't really think through like how do English speakers actually refer to this? Because again, it comes back to the fact that translation work is writing work, and the big challenge there is figuring out how to express these concepts in a way that native speakers of the language would.
Right, and you'd have to know, first of all, that wasn't a thing. Like you might assume that it was a thing because it makes sense and, it's been around for a while. So you would have to know that you don't know, right? And that's
and that kind of comes back to like it really helps to be well read in your, not necessarily your native language, but like the target language. If you're trying to work into, translating into English, but you're a native speaker of like Portuguese or whatever, you just happen to be native level. But it really helps to be well read in the target language, so that you can be able to pull these words and phrases out from where they need to be. Like long ago, back in the olden days of the internet, like the fandom for the video game Earthbound was really fond of the essayist and now stationery company owner Shigesato Itoi. And for a while, people would, in English, they would describe him as a writer of catch copy, which English speakers might kind of tilt their heads at because like English speakers don't say catch copy. And it turns out like it's just because the people who are like writing these profiles of this public figure on the internet, like they were just kind of taking the Japanese like catch copy and didn't really realize that it meant tagline.
Oh, I'm trying to think. Catch as in the past of like catch, throw the ball, catch the ball, caught
Right.
the ball. Like that's where
Yeah,
it's coming
that's
from. Catch company. And then I thought maybe you mean
yeah.
cat. And I'm trying to like figure that. I'm doing the same thing. I'm like tilting my
Yeah.
head, trying to work through that as well.
Yeah. And so like copy is just like as in like text copy, like
Uh-huh.
copywriting.
Yeah.
And the catch there is, I guess, probably derived from like the phrase like eye catching arrived in Japanese as a loan word is like eye
Uh-huh.
catch. And so
Uh-huh.
that kind of took on its own identity as well. Loan words, baby. That's languages.
So then at the end of the day, catch copy would be something positive then, right? It
Yeah,
would be
I mean,
like it's eye-catching copy.
yeah, like it's just like the Japanese word for taglines, like you'd use for like, a
Uh-huh.
movie or whatever.
Because it catches. Yeah, okay,
Yeah,
that's
like,
making sense now. Yeah.
yeah, like,
But how
catchy.
do you
Yeah.
translate that in one word? Like it's not a one-to-one kind of thing,
Right,
And
exactly. And that kind of gets
the
back
more
to
you
the
know.
point of you need to translate meanings rather than just the words, because a
Mhm.
lot of the time the words themselves can kind of lead you astray, especially if you're dealing with false friends, cognates, and loan words.
Right. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So you have to have all that stuff in mind too. There are layers, to all the translation that a lot of people wouldn't even think of, and especially these days
Right.
they're like, oh, throw it in AI,
Yeah.
but yeah, and I wonder, I'm just thinking out loud, I wonder how quickly like AI is going to be able to know that stuff, that, oh, catch copy is this. Okay, that's pretty easy. But also, what about
Hmm.
things that are kind of metaphorical or artistic in nature that don't
Yeah.
also translate one to one?
And I mean, even things like LLMs, like, or other, large language model based tools, it's only as good as the material it's trained on. There's a
Mm-hmm.
really common mistranslation in like formal texts, like, and not
Yeah.
necessarily formal text, but like official text in Japanese. Like the Japanese phrase is gensoku toshite, and even the Japanese government will translate it as in principle, but
Okay.
like literally it means as a principle. And in
Uh,
practice, it effectively means as a general rule. And so you have this widespread translation that even shows up in machine translations due to how much of a corpus there is that they're working from.
mm-hmm.
And the pseudo official translation gives the exact wrong impression of what it's supposed to mean.
Speaking of
Because it
accuracy, I'm
sounds,
sure it's
yeah,
very accurate. It's just not
because
really correct.
I mean, in this case, it's not even accurate because it's,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
a misparsing of the toste, which means as rather than, based on
Uh-huh.
in. But yeah,
Yeah.
and so you wind up with in principle, which sounds like the opposite of as a general rule. It's like in theory,
Exactly. In the
in
principle, the
theory,
idea
you aren't
behind the
allowed to
thing.
smoke here.
I could just picture that on like signs in places that, yeah. Then as you as the person, you're thinking, oh, I got that. I can understand that, but really it's
Yeah,
just not gonna work, that way.
yeah.
Hmm.
It's not very useful to see the theoretical discussion in contracts.
Now sign here, but it says in theory. Yeah. Like, what am I actually signing? Yeah, I can only imagine. Yeah, there's so many different layers, so many different styles. I would say you have to keep in mind the audience,
Hmm.
the client, like we said,
Yeah.
the boss. Let's say on the other
Hmm.
side. Yeah, you must feel kind of stuck in the middle, being pulled out in different directions, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to be said for that. It is true that ultimately your responsibility is to the client, and the client it's their prerogative to do essentially whatever they want to with what you
Mm-hmm.
provide for them because, they're the one paying for it. Like
Yeah.
it's work for hire essentially. And, they can
Mm-hmm.
make whatever changes they want to after it's been delivered. And
Yeah.
it's, I'm not going to like bring a lawsuit to say that they really should have left that the in there, but you do also want to kind of keep your audience in mind whenever possible, too, especially for things that are of an educational nature or that involve some sort of assumed cultural knowledge that is not shared internationally. So in Japan, for instance, a very real, very common cultural point of reference is the calendar system in a couple of regards. Like even just like at the micro level, Japan kind of functions on an April to March system in
Okay.
practice for most things. And there's a
Mm-hmm.
separate word to refer to like the April to March year versus the January to December year. But, in Japan, almost everything actually starts in April. Like April 1st is basically like secretly the real New Year's Day in Japan. It's when the school year starts. It's when like the baseball season starts. It's when TV shows
Oh, I didn't
start like
know.
new seasons or, new shows start airing. It's when new hires at companies will start. April 1st is, for most intents and purposes, the start of the new year in Japan. And so things like tourism pamphlets with like lists of events will often run April to March.
And what's the reason behind that? I don't know that.
I mean, if you go back far enough, like even Europe used to use a spring-based New Year until the Gregorian calendar, I want to say. And so there was a transition there. So yeah, it's basically just, the start of a new year is essentially arbitrary. And so they just kind of stuck with the convention of keeping spring as the start of the new year versus winter. And so you still do have some things for December 31st. Like that's also kind of treated as the new year in a lot of regards as well. But yeah, you have this sort of like split system. But also on a more macro level, Japan, for official purposes, does not use like the Anno Domini, like common era year numbering system. Because that's,
it's not needed.
It's fundamentally a Christian system.
It's a different totally different reference, not needed. Yeah.
Yeah. And so like people will obviously know and use that in everyday life. Like for official purposes, there's a separate a court calendar system that Japan's used for many centuries, where nowadays it's based on the reigning emperor. And so each emperor will basically, upon their enthronement, decide on an era name. And so right now it's currently the Reiwa era. And we are in the year Reiwa 7.
Okay.
Before that, we had the Heisei era. And before that, we had Showa. Before that, there was Taisho. And before that was Meiji. And so instead of like referring to like the 90s or like the Y2K era, people will just say like, oh, that's so Heisei feeling. And you have like the Showa period was basically the entire 20th century period of like massive social upheaval and rapid change. Like the Showa period ran from like 1925 or so to about 1990. And that was like a really big period for a lot of people and a lot of societies. And
we generally have decades, and that's like a good 70-year stretch right there.
Because of that, you have like these sort of cultural references and these sort of points of reference. Like you could say like, oh, this house was built in the Meiji period, which means a lot to Japanese people. It means like it was, this house was built in the period after Japan reopened to the rest of the world during that sort of like rapid westernization period. But, for a non-Japanese audience, you have to say something like this house was built in the late 19th century or the early 20th century, ideally.
This architectural style, or it has this kind of influence or something.
Yeah. A lot of the time, if you can, it's really helpful to be able to provide more specific like dates and eras, or just find ways to kind of fudge it. That's kind of a dirty secret to a lot of translations, that in order to get like a more natural, less awkward feeling result, you do have to kind of like fudge the details sometimes.
And you can't be as specific. To the same thing, right? Does the detail matter in the meaning? What's the actual meaning? It's more about the communication than, like we said, like a certain number or a certain word or something, right? So to me, it seems like the same thing. Like, what's the essence, of what I'm trying to get across? Yeah.
And of course, like there's also just practical considerations too. Like, there's a sort of notion in Japanese history that the Edo period, when they had like the day of the samurai and the shogunate government, like people were commonly referred to that as like this single period in time. But if you actually like look at how long it went, like the Edo period lasted for longer than the entire history of the United States to date as a country. And like, it's really not useful to think of that as like one specific thing.
Right.
Like we're talking about like 2.5 centuries, basically.
Yeah. That's the view from the outsiders, right? Which is, we're like, we'll just lump it all together.
Yeah. Like a lot of the time it's not useful to just like regard it as one single thing. It's like a lot more valuable to say like, oh, like, late 17th century or whatever, if you can kind of like narrow down the specifics a lot of the time.
If that makes sense. And then to the audience, like that time period will have a different meaning to them, for in the US versus Europe, like, absolutely. Yeah.
Part of it is also just a matter of like cultural points of reference too. Like a lot of people who are in non-English speaking countries are not familiar with, British. Like if you were to say like Elizabethan England or Victorian era,
supposed to know.
Yeah. Like if you're reasonably well acquainted with that kind of stuff, like Elizabethan might be like, oh, it's like Shakespeare times. And like if you say like Victorian, it's like, oh, it's like Charles Dickens times. But like, it's not things that normal people can be expected to know if they aren't familiar with like English history to some extent, of course.
Yeah, at least just the label, just the name, maybe with a little explanation that may clarify a bit.
Yeah. But, and, of course, it's also the whole thing, like, history all happened at once. And like, you have to bear in mind that like, Charles Dickens is as old to us now as Shakespeare was to him, or maybe even a greater distance.
Oh, yeah, good point about that. And like thinking about like, okay, well, things feel like they're changing so much more rapidly these days versus maybe in the past. There was kind of a longer stretch before you could notice some difference. So to a certain extent, maybe that's true in some places more than others as well. Yeah. So we've got the layer of, we could say the layer of time, the layer of cultural knowledge, that's put in there, or culturally embedded knowledge, let's say, that are in some words and labels and stuff like that. Coinages we mentioned too. All of this is
all about
going back to, like,
communication,
the
essentially.
writing. And how it's going to come out in the writing, because at the end of the day, the product that you're going to end up with is something that is written, so it has to express all that same things. And what else did you want to like tell us about that we might not know about? Because I'm fascinated by all this stuff. I never really thought about all that, all that goes into it.
Yeah, I mean, it is also just, you have to make it stand on its own. So like a lot of time it's beneficial to provide some extra content or context or details. And sometimes that involves doing some additional research on the side. Like you need to look up the full name of a historical figure. You need to look up like when they were born and died sometimes. Just you need to provide some sort of point of reference to a foreign audience of like, this historic figure was known for such and such a thing.
Yeah, like you're saying Dickens, right? Or maybe if I just said the name Hitler, like then not everybody in the world might actually know who that is.
I think that might not be a useful example, honestly. It was
to
literally
throw out a
called World
name.
War II.
Exactly. Point being that like not everybody knows what we think they know about like our history, and we wouldn't of theirs too, right? So sometimes you have to have some extra information in there too.
It kind of gets back to that whole like whatever that philosophical study is called of what you know and knowing what you know. The word is suddenly escaping me. Speaking off the cuff here rather than actually writing. I'd be able to look it up and figure out the proper word if I had a chance. But
Exactly. Or bonus points to anyone in the audience who's listening to this. You can send it in. We'll know
put it in the comments on YouTube. Increase our engagement.
Exactly.
Reduce our
Send it to
engagement
us.
numbers.
Yeah. For sure. That's a good idea, because we're busy like thinking about other things and like trying to like also have a spontaneous conversation about things that pretty well. But I'm thinking like, I never really thought of that. So I'm spinning a little bit in one direction and also try to make sure that we touched on all the topics that we said we wanted to talk about today. So was there anything else that you wanted to mention about translation, or maybe specific Japanese language or anything like that? Any other things that you can think of?
Yeah, I mean, for translation, one of the things that happens on a semi-regular basis is I'll find myself kind of wondering about if a thing that I intend to say in English is actually how people would say it necessarily. Because like sometimes you kind of get stuck in your own head, and it's very easy to sort of lose touch with I've lost touch with the common man.
Like maybe you have the same problem because you're, outside of your home country, but, with a lot of expats or people who speak English as a second language. And I'm thinking, is it make a party or is it do a party? Which one do we say? And I just find myself thinking, is that really real? Like, I don't remember anymore. Yeah.
Yeah. Like on a regular basis, I will, ask my various acquaintances from around the world, like, for just a vibe check on a given English word or phrase, and ask like, do other people actually say this, or is this actually just me? Or if you hang out in spaces with enough translators, you wind up with all these anecdotes about kind of stepping out to ask your roommate, like, do we say peel and onion?
Crack on onions, yes. Yeah. Do we say peel and onion? And it's funny you mentioned that, because somebody sent me the other day, we were talking about not even onions at all, but we're talking about layers, right? And somebody sent me this message of, I don't know if you watch the show Good Omens, but one of the characters, Michael Sheehan, he was on the Great British Bake Off, and I don't know what he was baking, but they said, oh, here, you have to peel the onion before you cook it. And I don't know about you, but in Mexico, our onions, the onions in the supermarket, they don't have the papery skin. Like that, I don't know, they just peel them off to make them more presentable, but you don't find that yellowy orangey paper skin. You only have these bright white oranges, and I'm like, oh, okay, that's cool. I'm used to it now.
Like, I know about the white onions in Mexico, at least.
They're like the bloomin' onions, I suppose. The Vidalia onions, I think they are. But yeah, so somebody said to the guy on the British Bake Off show, they said, here, peel this onion. And he literally thought that you took an apple peeler and you were supposed to peel the yellowy paper skin off there. And I think he ended up with like, what do you call them, Band-Aids on all of his fingers, because he just didn't know,
Adhesive bandages, we'll say.
Oh, plasters, probably we would say.
Yeah,
plasters,
we have to clear that with our legal team.
Exactly. Yes. We'll have to check on that one. Yeah. Exactly.
And sterilized adhesive bandages on his knuckles.
But you were saying, like, for you, it was more about like is this the correct like collocation? And let me just check with somebody else. But then you might end up with like another translator who also isn't sure. You might have like translator English going on,
Right. Yeah, I mean, like at one point,
nobody's
yeah,
sure.
I mean, I found myself asking, especially people who are not from the US, especially like, for instance, like if I were to say outhouse, will people who are not from North America know that it's like, a poop shed? Because
And
like
it's not
the
plumbed.
dictionary says in the UK it means like just a storage shed. And in
Uh-huh.
practice, after asking people who are from the UK and Australia, apparently that meaning is more of like a generation gap thing where in practice, there's enough, I guess, exposure to American media at this point that even in the UK, among like people my generation and younger, like outhouse mostly just means what you have instead of indoor plumbing rather than
Right.
where you keep your gardening tools.
Like, don't they call it a privet or a privy or something like
Yeah,
that? I think in the
privy is
a
just the toilet.
privy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So it
Privy, a
doesn't have to
loo.
be
Yeah.
outside. Uh-huh. Because I remember, for example, when I was living in Philadelphia, I lived in a row house, and I don't know if you can picture that, but the
I
sides are
am from near
shared.
Philadelphia, so
The
yeah.
I didn't even know that.
Yeah.
Represent. And they used to
Mhm.
have they didn't used to have plumbing indoors, and they would have like an
Mhm.
outdoor kind of a shed
Yeah.
bathroom in the back too. And that's kind of like what I'm picturing as well. Like, let's say
Yeah,
I've
more or
seen a lot of
less.
pictures of Dublin, in the last century before they had, a lot of the indoor plumbing. So I'm wondering what the word is that they use for that, right? Because I've also heard the word outbuilding, in American English, meaning like a storage shed,
Yeah.
not like having anything to do with using the restroom, let's say, you
Yeah.
know,
We call them persons of storage now.
persons of storage. Yeah. Places of storage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We don't say outhouse, we say outbuilding now. It's less
Yeah.
it's more inclusive.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
We want to use more inclusive language now.
Yeah, exactly. We can tell where you're from and who you talk to and who your friends
Word
are
puts the
from
little
that.
like squiggly underline. Are you sure you want to use this? You sure you want to say like,
Yeah. Some people might take offense and you might want to
yeah.
revise that a little bit.
Or,
Yeah.
we got to be more
People who
accommodating
might
to the
have
world. Yeah.
houses in general,
Mhm.
right? Like, yeah. So if there's no
Yeah.
outhouses, we can say the unouthoused or
Mhm.
something. I'm not sure how that would go, but yeah, that's another layer, right? We're
Yeah.
kind of touching on it. Is yeah, like different ways to phrase things and
Mhm.
sensibilities and
Yeah.
sensitivities and
Yeah.
like
Like
maybe
I joke
age
about it,
gaps.
but yeah, like
Yeah.
things like, yeah, there's a lot of things about just, uh, watching your phrasings and, things like you, even just, making a point of saying like fisher instead of fisherman or like, artisan instead of craftsman. Like ideally you do kind of want to avoid, the gendered languages, especially if you're
Mm.
talking about like more contemporary stuff where you have like more gender equality within the various industries as well.
Yeah, like things
But that's more of
you
just
you
a
can
general
probably.
writing issue thing.
Right. But also I'm imagining like something that was translated 20 years
Mhm.
ago, like might
Yeah.
actually need an update as well,
Yeah, I mean,
and they might
yeah.
need to be retranslated in a
Mhm.
way. Yeah. Oh, very interesting. Uh-huh. So is there
Yeah.
anything else that you can think of that you find interesting to share about translation and your work or even just, Japan in general? Any other thoughts?
I mean, yeah, ultimately, translation is mostly a matter of it's writing work. And if you find the task of trying to express a meaning in, the right sort of words, it's kind of a lot of the time it exists in kind of a middle ground between technical writing and prose writing, where you still have
Mm,
to try to express a very specific meaning that is presented to you, generally in a different language, of course, and you want to try to express that meaning in a way that will sound as natural as possible without getting too far astray of the original intended meaning. And then that kind of work can be, very satisfying.
yeah.
It can
I
also
was
be
gonna say
very isolating
satisfying. Yeah, I bet.
because,
Yeah, 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 yeah.
if you just, if you're freelancing, especially, you just kind of are sitting at home on your computer all day and
Doing your thing. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. I can. Yeah, I bet you can go down a lot of rabbit holes that way too, and drive yourself a little bit out of the zone of sanity. I imagine
yeah.
sometimes.
I mean,
But
like
yeah, yeah.
having all the Discord chats can be valuable for just having that exposure to the vibe
Uh,
checks for like asking people, does this sound okay? And it can also be a way of, you know,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
interacting with other humans in some way.
Making sure that the outside world still
Yeah,
exists as well. Yeah, and you're not the only one left on
yeah.
Earth.
And
But
the
yeah, oh,
difficulty of
good
just
point.
remembering to,
Uh-huh.
actually get your work done in the course of the
Yeah,
day.
yeah. Yeah, maybe the other is true. The opposite is true too, is like you get a little bit stuck in that and then you kind of go back and
Yeah.
forth. But yeah, good point of having almost like a resource, right, of other
Mhm.
people to ask about that. That's actually really handy as
Yeah,
well.
that can be very important too, because ideally, to me at least, ideally the goal with translation work is it should feel like it was originally written in the target language for other speakers of the target language. If it feels like a translation, then I generally regard that as a flaw in the work. Once in a while, it's inescapable, like especially if you're translating materials that involve like linguistic things that are specific to the source language.
Yeah.
But, leaving that aside for just general purpose stuff, I think that, if you're an aspiring translator, you should be willing to cultivate a willingness to split and break sentences as needed to have a more natural result in the target language. You should make a point of asking yourself, does this sound right? Does this sound natural? Does this sound weird if you say it this way in the target language? And always read through your writing before you submit it to wherever it's going.
Yeah. Yeah, especially if you're up late one night and you're translating something and then you're like, I'll just hit send. And then you see it later. And
Yeah.
not so much.
My own personal workflow for that is I use Omega T, which is computer assisted translation software that lets me, have internal checks and use like a glossary term base. And
nice.
after I finish doing translation work in that, I will export it to a Word file and I'll read through it again in there. And something about changing the font and just reading it all in like a single block really helps me. Once in a while, I'll find like some sort of a weird typo or phrasing. I'm like, who on earth did this? And I'm like, oh no, it was me several minutes ago.
I have no one else to blame but myself. Yeah.
Oh, my past self. What a fink.
My very recently past
self. A rascal.
Yeah, I do the same thing actually. If I'm writing like a for a YouTube video.
Yeah.
And it was funny the other day, my I had written, filmed, sent it off to the editor, and he said, "Oh, I'm gonna send you the first version. Great, I'm gonna look at it." And I was like laughing out loud, and I was like, "Wow, my editor is great. This is so funny." And I was like, "Where did you find that?" He's like, "You wrote it." I'm like, "I did? Did you know this?" I'm like, "Getting pretty good at this then." Yeah, and I genuinely it did not occur to me that I had done it, and he had to say, "No, look, it's in the original." I thought, oh, wow, that's amazing. So maybe the best litmus test for these kinds of things is if, like you said, if it looks like a translation, there's something amiss, right?
Yeah.
If you don't notice anything, that's probably like the best thing, when you don't notice because nothing sticks out, right?
Yeah. Or you're just tired.
Well,
or you're too close to it.
Right. Yeah.
Or
that looks great.
Yeah. Or you're too close to what's supposed to say. Really, the main takeaway here is the continuous self is an illusion.
Yes. None of this matters. Yes.
Yeah.
You're not actually reading this. It's not even words on a page. It's just all in your mind, right?
Your past
Everything
self.
is happening.
Your past self is a different person.
Exactly. So it's okay to say that they wrote it. It's totally fine. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, I want to say thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today about translation and your experiences. Because it's actually way more interesting than I originally thought it would be.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. I hope that more people, I don't know, I guess to help people find jobs someday doing things they enjoy. I don't really have anything particularly to say.
I was going to say, it sounds like the kind of work where you do it, you learn it, but there is a certain pride to it. And even if you don't get to kind of share that with people, even if it's kind of like behind the scenes and stuff like that, like there's a certain thing that you're like, yeah, man, that was a tough one. I did a good job. And I feel like that's the kind of thing that is something that's really valuable that I feel like we don't really get to experience a lot sometimes as people, because some people have office jobs and they just go and they clock out or whatever. But to have that pride in creation, I think it's really interesting and important. So I want to thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, I mean, the pride is important, but also you can't have too much pride because, you have deadlines.
Yeah,
and,
true.
The client will have opinions. So.
Yeah, exactly. You want to write and rewrite.
Yeah, but it's important to have exactly the right amount of pride.
Yes.
And also
know when to stop.
Yeah. Yeah. Have the right amount of pride, but also know, exactly when to stop and know which fights are worth fighting.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like, this is good enough. Like, this is good.
Yeah.
I could maybe make it better, but the input that I would need to do that isn't going to be worth like the outcome, you know? Yeah, totally. Cool. Well, Greg and Greg, I will say
Yes.
thanks again, and
Mhm.
hopefully we'll get to talk again if you can think of some other interesting topics. Like we could talk about culture, right? We could talk about some funny stories that have happened to you, maybe what it's like to have this certain group of people, right? Oh, here's a bunch of translators, and that's kind of
Yeah.
like our own little subculture, or
Mhm.
just what it's like being among expats and living outside the country. I think we got plenty of other episodes that you and I could record and talk about as well. And maybe next time we will have like a full studio on your side and we'll be able to see the
Oh.
real you.
Oh, I wouldn't expect that. Yeah, the camera's not on because we're kind of gonna, take a peek behind the curtain here. The camera's not on because right now I am set up using a folding mattress around me as acoustic treatment. I have a bright light directly behind my head on what would be on the camera. So I do look like a prestige drama in that regard. But yeah, outside of that, I am not looking like I've got a set up. I am looking like I have lived in a van for the last year.
And you said that originally. You're like, no, I don't even need to turn on my camera. I'm like, oh, don't be modest. Everybody says that. I'm sure it's fine. And you turn on the camera. I'm like, yeah, no, let's turn that right off again. And so,
Yeah, Bianca. Yeah, for the audience, Bianca can attest. I am not set up to have an on-camera set right now. I am in a
today, but maybe
storage
next
room.
time. We'll see.
Yeah.
Exactly. A lot of people are listening to this in the audio form, so they have no idea what we're talking about. But
Yeah.
yeah, Greg has not had his camera on this whole time. So you're missing nothing if you're listening to the audio version.
Yeah.
But I did get to see behind the scenes, and yeah, it's not out of modesty. It's that this is not gonna be a pleasure for you to watch today.
I assure you, I am exceedingly handsome.
Exactly. We'll keep the mystique as such, and we'll say maybe next time we'll get to show your face. But for now, we'll just say thanks to the audience. Thanks, guys, for listening today. If you have any questions, send us a line, and we'll be able to probably answer your question. And thanks so much for listening, and hopefully we'll see you next episode.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to plug in particular outside of like Lingthusiasm as a podcast is pretty good if you like linguistic stuff. I can ordinarily be found online on the Lingthusiasm Discord server and also the Discord server for Serlin Games. So if you like thinky tabletop games and also like to talk about linguistics, because for some reason a lot of the chat regulars there love to talk about languages, you can find me there.
Oh, funny. So yeah, you can find all that stuff down there. You'll be able to find Greg, and you'll be able to see his picture too, well, his avatar, let's say. And you'll be able to find him on those servers too. Like if you want to support Lingthusiasm, then you also get access to their Discord as well, which I can attest is awesome.
That's pretty good. We got a food channel, and because it's Discord, the food channel is maybe the least likely place you are to talk about food.
Yes, because it's not always the name, but it's always just like, oh, whatever happens,
Yeah, you got that Discord meta rule where the food channel is every channel but the food channel.
Yes. And
eventually.
Vice versa, I feel like. Yeah, I feel like the off-topic channel always seems to have a specific topic, and everything else has everything else. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
That's what the mods are for, is to enforce off-topic discussion in the off-topic channel.
Exactly. And so, you know what? This goes in this channel, but I may not follow that rule myself, but we'll see. Yeah, exactly. So join us on Discord, I would say. Find us on Discord, and and just get chatting with people.
Seek me out.
Is one to
Hunt me if you can.
Exactly. Yes. It's a mystery. First one to find him gets 50 points for sure. Yes. Awesome. Well, we'll say thanks again, and we'll say bye for now, and we'll see you guys in the next episode.
All right. Thank you
guys.
Thank you for listening, everybody.
Absolutely.
And
thank you, guys.
Stay
Thanks
in
again.
School and don't smoke drugs.
Thanks everybody for listening all the way to the end of the episode. I have to say, I've always felt like I was a pretty good writer. At least I've enjoyed it, and I really enjoyed the process of writing, because that's the thing. It's a process. It's kind of like there's no such thing as writing. It's always about rewriting and revising more than anything. Because that first draft that you write, it's probably, or at least it's hopefully, not the best writing you're going to end up doing for any one project. And that could not be more true with translation after speaking to Greg, because there's so many things to consider. And if there's things that you find interesting to talk about regarding accents and pronunciation, things that you'd like to hear that would make a good podcast episode, let me know, and I'll try to make it a reality. I'll find somebody who is willing to talk about that with us. In the meantime, you can join my community on Discord for free because, as we were saying, if you like this kind of thing, there are precious few spaces to really find your people. So I hope to see you there. The link is in the show notes. And if not, then I'll see you in the next episode. Bye for now.